my want, that is called the 2017 Georgetown Legal Report and the Sunset of the Traditional Law Firm Model. So I think, as you can infer from the title of the piece, provocative as it is, that the law report of Georgetown and Thomson Reuters gives ample data to support the conclusion that the traditional law firm partnership model is indeed on the decline. And that's a pretty startling statement to make, especially since as recently as 10 or so years ago, the traditional model was the delivery source for the vast majority of corporate legal work, both in the United States and indeed around the world in some form or fashion. So what I'd like to do briefly is to touch on some of the elements, some of which were briefly discussed in the Georgetown report, others of which I would argue were somewhat conspicuously absent, in terms of giving my view as to what's really going on and why. So the report, of course, talks a little bit about disaggregation. And I think that it's a term which, in terms of legal parlance, I think most people would associate with various legal tasks that are peeled away from the traditional law firm delivery model and done by others. And those others can be machines. Those others can be a combination of machines and lawyers or paraprofessionals who are working inside or largely outside of the law firm environment. They can be in-house legal departments, and they can be a growing array of legal service providers, read non-traditional law firms, which take on many forms. The early days of disaggregation, I think, were purely a labor arbitrage play. And this was something that was commonly associated with legal process outsource providers. Basically, finding English-speaking talent in places like India or the Caribbean Basin and using a dollop of technology that would allow those people to remotely conduct high-volume, low-value legal services such as document review. But we are now very much in the midst of a second generation of disaggregation, which involves a much more sophisticated utilization of technology in the delivery of legal services, and is very much a hybrid of labor arbitrage and also different kinds of technological devices that have created new delivery models and structures. And that, I would argue, is really the essence of what's going on today in the global legal marketplace. Of course, law firms have new competition, and it's coming from many quarters. So, for example, you've got the big four accounting firms, who increasingly, if you look at their service offerings and compare them side by side to the service offerings of large diversified legal firms, or legal law firms, they're virtually indistinguishable. You have competition also coming from tech and process savvy legal service providers, companies like Axiom, companies like United Lex, and a host of other companies that are coming up who are well capitalized, are using sophisticated technology, and increasingly are turning what were legal services into an array of legal products. You're also seeing new concessions being exacted from traditional law firms. That comes again in many different forms, ranging from the hoops that they have to jump through just to be considered for a particular matter, in the form of reverse auctions, RFPs, etc. But you are also increasingly seeing very, very aggressive discounting of legal services. You are seeing legal consumers now as much more sophisticated buyers who are examining a full range of options, both law firms and non-legal providers. Increasingly, what you're seeing is that law firms, their basic model, that is the traditional partnership model that is built on a pyramid of leverage where you have as many lawyers as possible working as many hours at high rates, sustaining the model. And increasingly, clients are saying, that may have been a very fine model for a long, long time, but there are systemic flaws with it now that are causing us increasingly to do one of two things. Either they are doing more work in-house, and that would include creating their own sort of in-sourced LPO capability. And so that I think is commonly referred to as legal ops companies or legal ops departments within corporate legal departments. Sometimes those legal ops functions are outsourced, and sometimes there's a combination of insourcing and outsourcing between corporate legal departments and outsourced providers. But the important thing is that increasingly that work is migrating away from law firms. So it's either going to corporate departments, as I said, some of whom, by the way, are beginning to create their own sort of spin-off businesses. One very interesting example I would offer is AIG, which was probably the largest spender of legal services of any company in the country, if not in the world. And AIG decided that they were going to create their own in-house capability. So over a period of 3 years, they created a very robust legal operations department, which was so successful in gathering AIG's own data that they decided they were going to actually spin the company off and sell those services to other large legal consumers. So it's just an example of the competition that law firms are up against. And it's not just the competition, but I think it's also the complexity of client business. Today, multinational corporations increasingly, and Andrew touched upon this, are having regulatory issues that go way beyond the complexity that they had ever confronted before. They have cross-border or multi-border transactions, whether they're corporate M&As or whether they're litigation matters. They are multi-border. And so the complexity of their business is something which increasingly a large number of corporate GCs and chief legal officers is saying that law firms are just not doing a terribly good job of keeping up with their business. I would cite you to a fairly remarkable recent survey conducted by LexisNexis and Cambridge University School of Business, focusing on the UK, but I think that their findings would probably be equally apt on this side of the pond. And what they learned was there was just a stunning amount of client dissatisfaction with law firm service. And one of the surprising, if not central, elements of that dissatisfaction was that the vast majority of law firms simply did not have beyond a kind of a basic understanding of their businesses. And for that reason, increasingly, they were turning away from law firms and either doing more work in-house or looking to the Big Four or other integrated service providers who could provide them not just legal opinions, but business solutions. In fact, the LexisNexis Cambridge survey revealed that clients said only 40% of senior partners at their law firms, that's their senior partners at their law firms, who they're still sending some business to, had more than a basic understanding of their business, which meant that 60% of senior partners did not. That is a pretty stunning statistic in my book. The LexisNexis and Cambridge survey went on to chronicle a number of fairly predictable elements of client dissatisfaction with legal services, including inefficient, poor service, a less than adequate customer satisfaction with the level of service, and an absence of a transaction. That law firms took more of a transactional as opposed to an enterprise approach to their business and cases. In other words, clients are looking for not just handling a case, but relating that case to other matters that the law firm is handling for the client. The result is, and this is the sort of headline of the Georgetown 2017 report, that there is a growing delta between an overall increase in a demand for legal services and a flat or declining call for law firm services. So this begs the question, in my mind at least, why don't law firms change? And I think that there are several answers which I will kind of run through quickly, being respectful of time. One is a generational divide between older partners and younger partners. Older partners basically do not have, no partners in law firms have equity, true equity. Equity is nothing more than profit sharing at law firms. And as a result, there is no long-term financial incentive for older partners to do anything more than take as much money out of the law firm as they can every year. Translation, it's a very short-term view of things. So that's one factor. And that has created, as I said, a kind of a short-term aspect to a law firm's way of conducting business. To those who would say, well, I read in the papers that large firm partners are still making a tremendous amount of money. How can you say, Mark, that law firms and their incumbent structure and model are really faltering? And to that, I would say that profit per partner can give a very misleading view of law firm health, especially if one considers that the migration from law firm services is increasingly one of a rejection of their model in favor of models that are more customer-centric, more tech-driven, more process savvy, engage in things like project management, etc. And one irony, I think, to the situation is another study recently found that law firms are spending more on marketing and business development than they ever have before, which kind of makes sense, except that you have to question how is it that they are, what is their message? How are they addressing customer dissatisfaction, and what are they doing about it? And equally importantly, how are they differentiating themselves from other firms? And I would submit that the answer to that is not terribly well, at least not presently. So where is this all taking us? Well, Susan Salkin had asked me if I might make mention of ClearSpire, a company that I was a co-founder of, and the kind of revival of its model. For those of you who are not familiar with it, ClearSpire was a two-company model. It was both a law firm as well as a service company. The centerpiece of the service company was proprietary technology that we developed, and the platform was called Coral, which enabled lawyers and clients to work collaboratively, seamlessly, in a way that promoted an agile workforce, gave rise to fixed price billing, knowledge and matter management, reuse of intellectual capital that the firm did on behalf of clients, etc. I think that it would be a bit self-serving of me to say that the reason that we were not the commercial success that some predicted for us, and that our commercial success did not, kind of parallel the intellectual approval that we were able to achieve. I think I would say that it goes much more than that. I think that our model was a bit ahead of our time. Nonetheless, there were many ways that we probably could have commercially succeeded had we zigged instead of zagged. But the point is that so many of the things that ClearSpire pioneered, and especially the divergence between the practice of law, that is, those tasks that law firms and lawyers should properly do, that require the exercise of professional judgment, or require lawyers to represent clients either in tribunals or in more high stakes kind of functions, such as helping to close a complex deal. Those are things I think that increasingly clients are looking at and saying, okay, I will use and pay for that expertise, even if it's resident in law firms with traditional models, but I don't need all that comes with it. And I think that is something else that is going on in the legal marketplace, as pointed out by the Georgetown report. So just to wrap up, I think that it is an extremely exciting time for legal entrepreneurs. In fact, I would argue that this is the golden age of legal entrepreneurs, because until very recently, a legal entrepreneur was a bit of an oxymoron. Law firms were pretty much the only game in town, except for corporate legal departments and government lawyers, etc. Today, the aggregate market share that law firms have is slightly over 50%, which means that almost 50% of market spend is accountable outside of law firms. That's principally coming from OGCs, and it's also coming from rapidly growing and a wide array of legal service providers. And so for you folks at CodeX who are particularly focused on the technology, I think that your mission and what you are doing is critically important, because I think that the new delivery models obviously are going to be far more tech-centric, far more process-centric than the kind of brute force approach to legal delivery that was so prevalent with the traditional law firm model. So one more time with feeling, I think it's a very exciting time to be in the legal marketplace, maybe not so much so for some law firm partners, but surely from the client perspective and from the creative entrepreneurial perspective, there are going to be many opportunities for new models and new structures to really, really gain a foothold. I would just say I'd be remiss if I didn't say also one word about access to justice. I think it's critically important to our democracy and to our rule of law that some of the work that you folks and others are doing be directed towards addressing the access to justice crisis. It's not just on the corporate end. I think that these new delivery models are important, but perhaps even more so in some ways in the retail space. So thank you very much, and I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Questions for Mark? I think, Mark, when you start, and by the way, on our side, your video froze. I don't know for folks online.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. I keep clicking it on, but it's not doing anything.
Okay. It's fine online?
It's fine on mine.
Okay,
yeah.
So it works for Susan, so that that's the most important. So now my question for you is you started out sounding a little bit skeptical about the conclusions of the Georgetown report, and I thought you would conclude that given that we've heard all this talk about the pending disruption of the industry, but yet we see so little change in the industry, you would call for a little bit more sort of tempered kind of assessment of this purported decline of the legal services industry. But then I think your conclusion is that yes, that you agree with most of what is said in the Georgetown report.
Yes. So forgive me if I was less than clear on the initial point that you made, Roland. I agree with the findings. In fact, I would argue that perhaps they don't go far enough. And specifically, I don't think that they really go far enough into what I think is the most critical element of it. Well, two. One is customer data dissatisfaction. And the second is that the migration away from law firms is not, some sort of a dip, as some still believe in the business cycle, but rather it is a systemic shift that's going on in the legal buy-sell dynamic. In terms of your second point about the disruption, I don't want to get into semantics. I think that what the legal industry is seeing is more of a kind of an incremental disruption. As I wrote in one article, just because law's Uber has not yet pulled up to the curb does not mean that there aren't a lot of people out there working on new models that may one day truly disrupt legal delivery. But I think I think that it's fair to say that some significant degree of disruption is occurring. Because if for no other reason than almost 50% of overall legal spend is no longer being delivered from a traditional law firm, which right. says to me that technology and process are now two of the three legs on the legal delivery stool, the third one being legal expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is fact. I mean, your analysis, I think, is very interesting. You speak with a lot of, real-world insights from the trenches. So this is, I think, gives a really great perspective. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Mark, you were discussing that you think that this is the golden age of legal entrepreneurship. To what extent do you think that there is room to create actual startups, or just basically for law firms to develop products that should help them deliver services better, but do not amount to a business model that can actually be turned into a startup?
I think that's a great question. Clearly, I think that there is opportunity to collaborate with law firms as a startup. Or I think what you're seeing now is, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a zero-sum game where it's going to be, so-called alternative providers or, traditional law firms. I do think that traditional law firms are going to very much have to change their sort of standard operating procedure. But to your question, I think that there is an opportunity for startups. I think that, in fact, there have been a record number of legal technology startups in the last year. There is a lot of investment activity going on in the legal vertical, which you hadn't seen before. So these are all indices, at least in my mind, that the smart money is saying, yes, there is an opportunity for startups. But I'll tell you, before I were to embark on a startup again, I think I would be perhaps looking towards, how I might be able to creatively collaborate with an incumbent provider, perhaps, to have a bolt-on service or the like, as opposed to trying to create a startup as we did with ClearSpire that was an end-to-end solution. And I hope, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Well, it seems that law firms are probably more receptive to this bolt-on solution that you're describing than ever before.
Well, and I'll give you an example, if I may, Roland. Well, two examples, actually. Law firms now, there is a legal service provider out there called United Lex. They've been in business for about 11 years now, and they are funded by Sequoia and by JP Morgan Private Bank. They have, basically a huge war chest. Quietly, they have about $175 million a year of annual revenue. And one of the things that they do is they've created a series of what they call legal solution centers, where they white label an integrated series of back office functions, focusing on contract management, the entire life cycle of data management, and things like that. And they've collaborated with a number of large firms. So that would be one example of a law firm collaborating with a legal service provider. That same legal service provider, and of course others like Axiom, have done a tremendous amount of collaboration with in-house legal departments. And finally, I would cite as another kind of interesting example of collaboration, Allen & Overy, the UK-based Magic Circle firm, has recently collaborated with Deloitte in connection with, interestingly, software developed by Allen & Overy, not Deloitte, but marketed principally by Deloitte, not Allen & Overy. So there are a lot of interesting combinations and permutations that are going on in the marketplace that I would think would play well to the opportunity for startups.
So we're pretty much already over our time, but I just wanted to see if anyone online had maybe one final question for Mark.
I can't believe that Monica Bay is still on and isn't asking a question.
Must be a technical problem. I don't know. It's true. Monica, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, there you are.
Sorry about that. I got it all tiled up there. So what's your big thing for the next 6 months?
Personally, or in terms of what my crack crystal ball is seeing?
Whatever you want to say.
Well, I would just say that I would continue to be looking very closely at different collaborative things that are going on. I would also be looking in terms of a growing number of legal innovation zones that are going on. One is in Ireland. That was an investment of Baker and McKenzie. Another is a legal innovation zone that Allen & Overy is creating within its offices in London. And a third one is in Canada at Ryerson University. And I think what we're seeing is increasingly a willingness to create areas where legal technologists can incubate, because to the questioner's comment about, do I think it's a good time for startups? Yes, I certainly do. And I would look for, even more of these kinds of innovation interdisciplinary zones surfacing around the globe.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really fascinating, super helpful to get your perspective on the market. And yeah, thank you again for joining us. Thank you both our presenters.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, Mark. And we'll meet again next week. See you all again next week. All right, thank you. Goes.